All right, I'm just looking at the clock. It's 12 o'clock, so this is the start of our talk. I would, again, lovely to see so many people from all over the world. It's not just, from Europe or London. I'm Andrea Revesz. I'm from University College London, and I'm a member of the Center for Applied Linguistics. And Peter Skehan has kindly agreed to give this talk as part of our seminar series. So we are super lucky to have him. But he's our staff member, as you will hear in a minute. So in a way, he's home himself. So what's going to happen today? First, Peter, I'm going to introduce Peter, just tell you about his many achievements, and then he'll do the talk, and then we have Q&A afterwards. Some of you might have joined later. The talk is being recorded, so the recording is on, just to make you aware. All right, so let me introduce Peter. It's a great pleasure to introduce him. He's Professor Peter Skehan, and as I just mentioned, we're very fortunate to have Peter as our honorary research fellow at the moment here at UCL. So he's one of us. Peter is someone I know. You're here probably. He doesn't need an introduction to you. Everybody in this Zoom call is surely familiar with at least some of his many accomplishments. His main interest areas lie in task-based language teaching, language testing, and foreign language aptitude. He started his work on these topics back in the 1980s, getting his PhD in applied linguistics from Birkbeck College. Then he had several appointments in London, including Thames Valley University, which doesn't exist anymore, King's College London, and importantly for us here, he also worked at the IOE. Then he spent some time in the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the University of Auckland and New Zealand, and then he returned to London, again, fortunately for us. According to Google Scholar, he has more than 150 publications, maybe more, it's just Google Scholar, which have been cited more than 30,000 times. This is an amazing number. I'm not sure how familiar you are with citations, but this is probably one of the highest in our field. Among these publications, several are books related to task-based language teaching and cognitive aspects of second language learning. And most of his journal articles were really published in the most prestigious journals in our field. To honor his contributions to task-based language teaching and SLA, he was the inaugural recipient of the Distinguished Achievement Award given by the International Association for Task-Based Language Teaching. And he's also among the few SLA scholars who have their own entry in the Encyclopedia of Applied Linguistics. Before handing over to him, I also wanted to tell you two things that you may not know about Peter just yet. And now Peter is getting, nervous what she's going to say. He's not only an outstanding scholar, but he's also an amazing mentor. Just to give you an example from my own experience, I remember when I just finished my PhD, and I was waiting for a bus, at the bus stop after one of the TBRT conferences. And he spent at least an hour waiting with me for the bus just to discuss my PhD and some of the findings in them. So, that was one of the best moments of at that point in my academic career. And the other thing you might find even more surprising, that you might not have thought that before embarking on his academic career, Peter has also been an excellent sportsman. He was crowned as the Welsh champion in the triple jump athletic event. All right, so these were my two pieces of information, and let me ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Peter Skehan. There would be applause in the room.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. As you were speaking, I was remembering a previous conversation, and I was regretting having told you what you've just passed on to everybody else. Well, yes, there we go. I'll have to recover my composure now after that. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's very nice to be given this opportunity, though it's a bit forbidding because top of the screen, I have a bar which gives various bits of information, including the number of people, the number of participants. And worryingly, it's still going up. Not very much, but still, that's going to be a worry. I'll see if I can close that. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite words, which is humble brag. And now I'm going to engage in a little bit of humble brag myself. If you don't know this word, it's worth finding out about. I was given the Messick Memorial Lecture Award earlier this year. And this is, Samuel Messick was a very distinguished language tester. And the award given annually also requires the recipient to give a talk. And really just to say, this is a revised version of that talk. It was a considerable surprise when I got this award, because although actually Andrea mentioned that language testing was one of my interests, and it is, I haven't been active in that field for quite some time. So the last thing I was expecting, this is the humble brag bit, the last thing I was expecting was to get this award. So it was nice, but also worrying, because I had to think, what on earth can I talk about? Excuse me. And if I didn't believe in myself as a language tester anymore, how could I be talking to language testers? So one does, I think, the same thing in these circumstances, almost all of us. You find a way to talk about what you are interested in and link it to the general topic that you've been given. So, as you can see, the title is Linking Second Language Speaking Tasks and Language Testing. And so you can say, why should I focus on speaking? Well, testers look at speaking, but from my point of view, my more active area of interest has been task-based second language performance. And if you look at that, there's a lot of research, it connects with psycholinguistics, and effectively, this whole literature, although it's concerned with speaking tasks, is not driven by test formats, whereas language testers do tend to be somewhat obsessed by the formats that are used within tests of spoken language. So I thought maybe this is a different perspective on looking at the same sort of thing. Okay, so what am I going to do here? The broad outline of the talk is I'm going to have a brief look at some models of testing and of speaking. Then, the major theoretical part, I'm going to explore implications of taking a Leveltian approach to look at task difficulty and the idea of ability for use. Then I'm going to look at task research, because I think the task research can be related to many of the things which are involved in language testing as looked at through task difficulty and ability for use. Then I will explore the implications of this research for testing, and an important final bullet point, the slides and associated bibliographies are with Andrea, and I think therefore will be available to you. So you don't have to be slavish about this. You can have access to all the slides, and the bibliographies there are two. One, well, they're both in the same file. One of them is alphabetical in the conventional way, and then there's a second bibliography which is linked to the different slides that I'm going to cover. So if a particular slide piques your interest, you will be able to go to that bit of the bibliography and pick up what influenced the things that I cover in that slide. Okay, so let's look at some models very, very briefly. Part of the reason for doing this is that in many ways, I'm going to say at several points, what I'm doing is often repackaging what other people say. And so here are some of the people I'm going to repackage. Canali and Swain talked about communicative competence. They, following Del Hines, they promoted the way you have to go beyond linguistic or grammatical competence, and you have to think of other things like sociolinguistic competence, discourse competence, strategic competence. Lyle Bachman built upon their research. He talked about language competences, I think he called them organizational competencies, lexis, grammar, even discourse, and also strategic competence. That's to say, and perhaps I should say, Canal and Swain saw strategic competence as what you did to compensate for problems. Bachman took a different perspective and said strategic competence is at the heart of all communication. Jan Hulstijn has talked about basic and higher level cognition and core and periphery. And in some ways, it's core and periphery which is more relevant to the sorts of things I'm going to be talking about today. So the things they've got in common, all of these people really have some sense of an underlying competence and a way that you have to activate that competence, to bring it to be effective in communication. And so they all say something about how the activation works, but they take different perspectives slightly. And so if you relate this to language testing, what they're doing, because what you do when you devise language tests is sample something that's of interest because you want to make decisions based on it, because you want to generalize. And so all of these people are giving us ideas about what should be sampled and how it should be sampled in order to be able to make decisions and generalize. Okay. And they clarify the challenge if one is going to try and relate task research to language testing. So these people so far have been language testers. Here we have a first language psycholinguist, William Levelt, talking about first language speaking. And his approaches have been adapted to the second language case, particularly by Judith Kormosch, Kees de Bot, some others. Levelt talks about stages, processes in speaking, conceptualization first, the ideas, formulator, clothing the ideas in language, in words, with grammar, and then producing a phonetic plan and actually articulating the speech. Underneath the processes are various knowledge sources, and you can see underlying the conceptualizer, things like discourse model, situation knowledge, and so on. Underlying the formulation, notice that I've got things involving L2. In the first language case, what would underlie the formulator is the first language mental lexicon. In the second language case, we've got the L2 lexicon, which is a different beast altogether. We also have L2 declarative knowledge and rules. What the key to this is that obviously in the second language case, it may be the case that the L2 lexicon is limited. It may be the case, therefore, that what could otherwise be an implicit basis for speaking has to become explicit and rely on declarative knowledge and rules. And the point of this is that relying on these not such complete knowledge sources can lead to problems and breakdown. It also means that managing the system, which we're not aware of really in first language speech, managing the system also becomes more of a challenge. So to summarize that, in the first language, each of the stages makes reasonable demands only where reasonable depends on the strength of the first language mental lexicon. You get parallel processing. That's to say, one conceptualizes, one formulates, and one articulates at the same time, even though at different stages of the speech production process. What you're formulating, what you're speaking, actually was conceptualized a moment or two ago. So second languages have the problem of a limited second language mental lexicon, and there are problems from it's not complete, it's not rich, and it's not so fast. It can be disfluency. Speaking becomes a sort of serial process where problems have to be solved. And as I say, management of the whole system becomes more important. Okay. End of part one. Now we get on to the two areas of conceptualizer formulated differences and ability for use. Essentially, what I'm trying to argue in the next few slides is that what makes things difficult for the conceptualizer is different to what makes things difficult for the formulator stage in Levelt's model applied to the second language case. The conceptualizer has got to deal with ideas, and quite a lot, not simply bare propositions, but assessing a situation, establishing what your point of view is going to be, choosing what should be said and what shouldn't be said. That's what leads to difficulty doing these things with the conceptualizer. Sometimes simple memory will do. On other occasions, you've got to do a lot of thinking. It delivers the pre-verbal message, essentially non-linguistics. Right. Typically, the conceptualizer goes wrong if there are considerable demands on the thinking processes that underlie speech, or if attention is interfered with because something else is going wrong somewhere else in the system, or, as somebody from my age would say, senility is a factor, which you can't joke about too much. Well, I can't. Okay, we get on to the formulator. So the formulator clothes the pre-verbal message through using the L2 mental lexicon. Lemmas are triggered, and the important thing is, lemmas are not simply what you might think of as a dictionary, a simple dictionary entry. They contain a lot of information about syntax, about phonology, about discourse, about collocation, and about connotations. Ideally, if this all flooded into availability very quickly, things for the second language speaker would be a lot easier. But the second language mental lexicon is not so big, things are slow, and sometimes only partially retrieved. And so a lot of conscious attention is required to deal with these limitations, often leading to repair, the need for repair. Right. And so the point I want to make is, what makes the conceptualizer stage difficult is different to what makes the formulator stage different. And when we think about applying this Leveltian view to language testing, because something I haven't actually said explicitly, but I should, language testers are obsessed by difficulty, item difficulty, task difficulty. And they would like to be able to arrange items or tasks according to some scale of difficulty. So essentially, the point that I want to make is, at the heart of speaking, you've got to think about difficulty being influenced in different ways at the conceptualizer stage and at the formulator stage. And so different variables may well be implicated with each of these. And what I've tried to do here is give you a matrix. And as you can see, going down on the left-hand side, we've got formulator easy, formulator difficult. On the right-hand side, conceptualizer easy, conceptualizer difficult. And what I've tried to do is to give some idea in each of the cells of what it would be like to have an easy conceptualizer task as well as an easy formulator task, or a difficult conceptualizer with an easy formulator. And so I've tried to give some ideas because influenced here by the sorts of things that go on in task research, you can see the sorts of things that might lie behind tasks at these different levels. And a couple of bullet points, 3 bullet points down there. I'm making this a dichotomy, really. It's a climb, it's gradual. There are implications for sampling here, because if you want to sample somebody's speaking ability and then generalize from it, this 2x2 matrix gives you an idea of the range of things that you would need to probe. there are also implications for difficulty. And as I say in the final bullet point, cell A versus cell D is easy. But what do you do with B and C, where one of the things is difficult, but the other is easy? How do you fit them in? And here I've actually got closer to giving you tasks arranged in this way, which might have relevance for organizing your approach to language testing. So that something like comparing family trees in a pair, two of you compare family trees. Essentially, the linguistic demands in that task are relatively straightforward. Have you got an uncle? Have you got a grandfather? All that sort of stuff. Well, have you got a grandmother as well? Also, you're likely to know if you've got a grandmother or an aunt or 3 children. And so the amount of conceptual pressure is very limited. Going to effectively what would be cell D, bottom right, I've got an example taken from work by Roger Gilabert and mentioned by Andrea, I think, in the conference on Saturday, imagining that you're a fire chief and you've come to a burning building and there are all sorts of problems in the building, both practical as well as personal, where you've got to decide with limited resources who you're going to save. And what I've tried to do then is to use the Levelt approach to try and organize the sorts of difficulty one could propose for different sorts of tasks. In this case, mostly coming out of the task research field, but relevant, it seems to me, for testing. And you've got to see the bullet point, and this links with the references. John Norris and a group of other people in Hawaii have attempted to take this approach and relate it to testing more in a university context, but still. Sheila Luo, PhD student of mine in Beijing, has attempted to do this for secondary school children in a Chinese context. So there are examples where people have tried to relate this sort of thing to the testing arena. Okay, now a switch. I said the 2 theoretical areas, first of all, were difficulty, and the second is ability for use. And if you recall, when I was talking about Knarlin, Swain, Bachman, Jan Hulstijn, they all were wrestling with the problem of how do you take any underlying abilities and put them in, plug them into the way language is actually used. And you can see the general background there. A slower declarative knowledge store is often important. The limited second language mental lexicon creates difficulties for the second language speaker. It's very important to deal with these problems, to manage these problems, the things that happen automatically in the first language, but in the second language, to use what you've got as effectively as possible. And as a sort of general label, it seems to me, ability for use is a useful construct to think about for the way in which this management takes place. Remember, first of all, the knowledge sources. A general knowledge base. This was from the diagram of the Levelt model. A general knowledge base, a second language mental lexicon, and declarative knowledge. Okay, what's ability for use? Well, I'm going to propose 4 components. Conceptualizer formulator processes, very similar to Lyle Bachman in some ways, when he talks about assessment, planning, and execution as being important parts of strategic competence. Then I've got working memory and speed. Jan Hulstijn talked about these things. Then metacognition and management, which you'll see is perhaps where I put most effort here. And finally, compensation ability. Knarlin, Swain, and Hulstijn talked about this. It's interesting, these various people talked about sometimes the same things and sometimes different things. Anyway, let's have a look at each of these in more detail. Yes, obvious repackaging going on here. So the conceptualizer and formulator processes, well, the retrieving, the organizing, manipulating ideas, evaluating a situation, and so on, doing the things that I talked about earlier with Levelt. Remember, this is concerned with thinking. Second language speakers can think just as effectively as first language speakers. And so here you're looking at what they do to develop the ideas that they want to express. But then you've got all these different processes involving retrieval from the mental lexicon. First language speaker does this efficiently, second language speaker doesn't. But I think the point of putting it in under this heading is people vary clearly in how effectively they use these basic processes in speaking. But then we've got working memory and speed. Speaking requires accessing and using a lot of resources. The faster your system is working, presumably the better it is. The larger your working memory, perhaps the better it is. I should slip in at this point that the next big section of the talk, the last big section of the talk, is concerned with evidence which is relevant to the sorts of things that are being claimed here. So I will be referring back to some of this a lot of the time. Does working memory, does greater working memory have an impact on the effectiveness with which you can speak? Okay, metacognition and management. Really, as you can see from the subheadings here, I feel a lot is packed into this area, the management of what people do when they're speaking. There's general coordination. There's insight into the actual system. If you're a second language speaker and you know you don't have the same level of second language mental lexicon as you would like, you've got to do something about it. And knowing about the fact you've got to do something may make you more effective at communicating. For example, being able to judiciously use formulaic language or fillers. So insights into your own capacity, knowledge of your own memory limitations, also knowledge of the discourse of speaking. And in yellow and underlined, so it's an obvious clue, I think this is important, an ability to use the conceptualizer in such a way that you are protected against problems at the formulator stage, most effectively by producing sets of pre-verbal messages which you can return to even after you've had some formulated difficulties. And I put here interaction ability, turn-taking, awareness of status in communication, ability to attend to feedback, even to use it, and so on. So metacognition is a major area here. And finally, compensation recovery ability to be resourceful when problems occur, an ability to have learned from previous communication so that knowing there'll be a problem, to have some idea of what you do when that problem occurs. Okay. And this is the end of part 2. So what I'm going to try and do now is talk about task research and to try and link it to this view of difficulty and to link it as well to the components of ability for use, because in one sense, all I've done so far is present you with a list of things and with sub-lists as well. And so what I'm going to try and do is to say, well, actually, I think second language task-based research into speaking can illuminate the actual functioning of some of the points that I've been making as I've covered what seems to be a daunting list. So, task research. What does it do? How could it contribute? Well, as I said earlier, it's a different way of looking at test tasks. not confined to saying, how do two formats, which are convenient to use in tests, how do they relate? No, it looks at what task researchers have done and sees if it's relevant. Task researchers also tend, compared to testers, to operate on a smaller scale, but connected with that, they tend to look at performance in a more detailed way. And that more detailed perspective can give insights which you wouldn't get from the wide range of dealing with 5,000 people doing a test, which is, not uncommon. So task researchers look at things like task conditions and task characteristics, and I'll cover those. And in particular, and yes, other possibilities exist, indeed they do. I'm going to focus on some which connect with research I've been most familiar with: planning, task characteristics, working memory, conceptualizer, formulator, balance, proficiency, style, and measurement. So I'm going to work through these now. Okay, planning. Task conditions. Well, there are many ways you could interpret task conditions. As it happens, lots of researchers have spent their time looking at planning, often 10 minutes pre-task. Many researchers use this. Testers tend not to. They tend to use less time because for testers, time is very precious. Whereas for researchers, they are more willing to get people to spend 10 minutes to plan. Okay, when there's planning like this, what happens? Well, very consistently, the complexity of language and the fluency of language increase. It doesn't have to be 10 minutes, people sitting down planning, well, even after they've had the task explained to them. You can do other things, which is interesting. You can model behavior. You can show them videos. You can explore what impact having specialist knowledge or previous use of language in a certain area, what these influences might have. Interesting work done by Uta Mehnert and Judith Kormosch and others and colleagues. Although I've said 10 minutes, in fact, different things happen, it appears, during the 10 minutes, and even if there's opportunity to repeat tasks. As more time is given, accuracy is raised first, then fluency, and complexity finally. Planning has stronger effects the more complex the task. And interestingly, if learners are given help when they're planning, something that Pauline Foster talked about on Saturday, sorry about the people who weren't at the conference on Saturday, if people are given help when they plan, that is remarkably effective in raising performance. A point I'd like to make, this is a personal grudge on my part. In some ways, I think giving second language speakers and actually people doing second language tests, giving them planning time sort of levels the field because it gives people more chance to mobilize their own ideas, their own opinions, and their own past lives. And in some ways, it combats the way with second language speakers we often ask them to do things we would never ask first language speakers to do. Suddenly plunge them into arbitrary tasks. I think there's a psycholinguistic and even a human justification for using planning, though I can imagine many people would disagree. Okay. And there's an enigmatic last bullet point. Various people have applied planning research to language testing. The generalization is not completely straightforward, and I think this is an area where there's lots of scope for research in the future. Okay, carrying on with planning, I want to talk here about research that I have done with Francine Pang. And given that you give people 10 minutes planning time, it's interesting to consider, to ask people, what did you do in that 10 minutes? It's what we did in this study. And we related what people said to their actual performance. In other words, the question was, the possibility is, do people doing certain sorts of things during 10 minutes planning produce better performance than people who do other things? And that actually was the case. What we found in terms of good ways of using planning time were, think about how trouble will occur and also be realistic. Think during planning what you're going to do when the trouble occurs. Emphasize ideas and avoid detailed grammar focus. Plan small or specific. Don't overdo things. In other words, what this added up to was actually the link between planning and metacognition. The people in our study were clearly, some of them, not all of them, clearly self-aware and were able to exploit their knowledge about themselves and what they could do and what they could remember. And the people who indeed were more sensitive to this then turned out to do better in the actual task. So I think we're looking at a way in which metacognition would be relevant for language testing through ability for use. Now, there are some other, I'm emphasizing planning, I do accept, it's a personal obsession. Here's some other planning research. Rod Ellis distinguishes between the sort of planning that comes from preparation before a task and what he calls online planning. That's to say, if the time conditions for doing a task or a test are not so great, you have opportunity to plan on the fly while you're actually speaking. And he's been able to show that in general, if you give people less pressured time conditions, they will become more accurate, not particularly more complex, not particularly more fluent, in fact, possibly the reverse, but they will become more accurate. So now I've got three extensions of that I want to talk about. What's interesting is, and this comes from research done by Mohammed Ahmadian, what he found was if you measured working memory and you gave people planning time, working memory correlates with performance if you have online planning, but it doesn't correlate with performance if you have pre-task planning. And there's a curious parallel that working memory correlates with a repeated performance, but not the original, leading to the possibility that working memory, which is, I argued, part of ability for use, isn't relevant all the time. It needs helpful conditions, either to be dealing with relaxed time pressure or to be dealing with a repeated performance. It doesn't simply give a generalized advantage when you're speaking. The conditions have to be right. Okay. A second aspect of the planning research with Jan Wang, a student of mine in Hong Kong. She had different conditions planned. She had no planning, online planning, and pre-task planning. And what she found was, because she also gave students a conventional, perhaps competence-oriented proficiency test. When you give them this test and correlate it with their performance on the task, particularly accuracy, the correlation is there as long as there has been planning, and best of all, when there's been online planning. If you don't give planning time, the proficiency test doesn't correlate with performance. And this led us to propose, I know, a bit fanciful this, the proficiency mobilization principle, that some testing conditions allow proficiency to be brought to a general competence-oriented proficiency to be brought to bear on performance more effectively than other conditions. And a final thing, again from Jan Wang, when you have pre-task and online planning together, you have tremendously improved performance. That's to say higher complexity, accuracy, and fluency. And so we proposed the Conceptualizer Formulator balance principle. Conditions, in other words, in a test or in a task, where you give somebody an effective way to think about what they say, and also good conditions to talk about it. Okay, let me see.
Peter, you're muted.
Is that better? Good. Right, sorry. Oh, goodness. Who can understand these things? Not me. Right, now I'm talking about tasks. And there are a range of findings from the study of tasks. Type of information favors certain sorts of areas. The structure of a task has a strong influence on performance. Operations on data, yes, you're thinking Peter Robinson at this point. Reasoning often leads to greater complexity and higher Lexis scores. Time perspective, transformation or integration of material. If a task requires integration of ideas, of information in a picture series, if there needs to be transformation, complexity is raised. Number of elements, a strong cognition hypothesis factor isn't very straightforward. It's been hypothesized to be, but I don't think the evidence is strong. Lexical demands, more advanced lexis can lower fluency. Negotiable, that's to say, doing a task where you can choose what you do and you're not stuck inside a straitjacket. Negotiable tasks seem to allow people to reach higher levels of complexity. Monologic, dialogic, if there's engagement, dialogic tasks raise complexity and sometimes accuracy. Oh, that worked nicely. So an evaluation here. There are successes looking at generalizations which have emerged from the task literature. And I think as well, you can link the areas where there have been successes to Levelt's Conceptualizer Formulator operations. But I actually think that the progress that's been made with task features, task characteristics, task types, and the way these have been linked to performance, this is simply in task research, not testing yet, has been a bit disappointing. There's been a degree of inconsistency in research results. And so I think I would argue that we don't yet have a convincing theory of task characteristics impacting on performance. Lots of interesting findings, but I don't feel yet we can weave them into an overall theory. And so in a curious way, and this would please language testers, I'm sure, the implications for language testing are not very clear. I think in principle, tasks may not be neutral and performance may be the result of particular tasks which are chosen. But in order to justify that claim, I think I would like to see much more research than currently exists. I think there's lots of scope for the future. Right. Andrea, can I check with you? 6 minutes, 9 minutes, 10 minutes?
We have 1.5 hours, so it's absolutely fine if you.
Okay. Well, yes, don't worry. It's getting there now because I just have a series of slides, I think 3, which are talking about the measurement implications from task research, which might have, something to say about language testing. And to preface this, for people in the audience who don't spend their time doing task researchers, for better or worse, have tended to look at performance in terms of complexity, accuracy, lexical performance, and fluency. Of course, there are lots of other things you could look at. Task outcome, interaction, but these are the things that have tended to be the focus for lots of research. And I'm going to go through them because I think I mentioned earlier that task researchers tend to work at a smaller scale, at a greater level of detail. And so the point here is simply to say, maybe this level of detail can reveal things which large-scale testing studies don't reveal so clearly. That's the bold claim. The first area then, complexity. Typically, people look at the amount of subordination in spoken performance, and separate from that, the number of words typically used in clauses. What's interesting is that the two measures don't correlate. The fact that you produce more subordination has little connection with how long the clauses are. And what's interesting is that some of the time you get things like a narrative task or planning, which raise both of these measures of complexity. But then you get other factors which raise one, but not the other. And again, some research I did with Francine Pang, different to the research I talked about a few minutes ago. We used cluster analysis with complexity, accuracy, lexis, fluency measures. And what cluster analysis does is, if you've got a bunch of people doing a task, most of the time when you do things like factor analysis, these procedures look at how the measures, for example, words, number of words in a clause, amount of accuracy, amount of fluency, how the measures relate to each other. Cluster analysis is different. It looks to see if people relate to one another. In other words, it's trying to explore if there are subgroups of people who perform in similar ways with similar profiles, but differently to other groups of people. And in this research, what we discovered was there are indeed styles of performance. And we claim to have identified some people who use a sort of discourse style. They are the subordinators. They're faster, they pause less. And they contrast with a clause-oriented style, people who tend to use longer clauses, but don't particularly subordinate. They tend to be slower and they tend to pause more. Now, this brings me to the final bullet point. Spoken performance with tests is usually assessed by rating scales, and effectively looking at different performance areas in detail might provide insight as to what should be put into rating scales. Now here, it seems to me, if we have different types of people, subordinators or clauses, maybe that could have an impact on the nature of the rating scales which are used to assess performance. Okay, fluency, very interesting area. Task researchers love it. Have established, I think, different sub-areas of fluency. Speed, breakdown, that's to say unfilled pauses, what I call retrievable disruption. That's to say, probably people using filled pauses. And finally, repair, reformulation, replacement, repetition, and so on. These have come out reasonably clearly, I think, in task research. They therefore would have implications for rating scale construction. And they certainly have had that impact. Parvane Tavakoli, who has worked in this area has related detailed fluency measures to CEFR levels and shown, very interestingly, that fluency measures tend to plateau in the way they distinguish between CEFR levels. Important at lower levels, not so important at higher levels. I'd also throw in a bit more of that research that I've done with Francine Pang and also another co-researcher, Sabrina Schum, where we've shown that there's considerable cross-task consistency in some fluency areas and not in others. So, for example, speed doesn't generalize across tasks, but things like breakdown and repair are very consistent. So you're drawn into saying a pauser is a pauser is a pauser. There's also been research to suggest, by Nivea de Jong, for example, Tracy Derwing, to suggest that L1, L2 consistency exists. That's to say, if you're an L1 pauser, chances are you're going to be an L2 pauser as well. So again, I think task research is relevant to testing, because if you're measuring fluency and you discover that somebody pauses a lot, what are you assessing? Are you assessing their second language speech, or are you simply assessing the way they communicate? It's a real puzzle for testers, I think. Okay. Accuracy and nexus, I think there's less to be said. Accuracy is measured in lots of different ways, but they tend to agree with one another really quite strongly. For all that, the error gravity measure that Pauline Foster promotes, I think, does have the greatest construct validity, but they do intercorrelate highly. With Alexis, I think we're just scratching the surface here. We have measures of type token ratio, and we have measures of lexical sophistication. The first is called a text internal measure, and it sort of measures the extent to which you recycle the same words when you're speaking, or you draw in a wider range of words. The second reflects the extent to which you use more challenging words, perhaps less frequent words. It's interesting, the two from the task research do not correlate. Think then, if you were devising a rating scale for testing, how would you set about it? You would have to worry about this lack of correspondence in thinking how you capture vocabulary knowledge and vocabulary use more when people are doing the test. Okay, enter part 3. Now then, I'm going to give you a couple of summary slides and then a picture, and that's it. So we are close. Summarizing the claims. So broadly, influences on difficulty may be different for the conceptualizer and the formulator stages. Okay, this might have relevance to designing groups of tasks in relation to sampling and calibrating difficulty and generalizing. Second language speakers have to manage multiple and limited resources and competences. How they manage such limitations could have a huge impact on their performance and how you can generalize, because when you're testing, you're trying to get information quickly, which is the basis for going way outside the testing context. You're not there just filling half an hour in the life of the people taking the test. You want to make decisions on the basis of the information you get. What's the best way of generalizing? Well, it seems to me, if you can't test in a way which implicates, which draws in ability for use, your capacity to generalize is not going to be so powerful. And a couple of technical things. Task conditions do influence performance. Well, yes, I hope you're more convinced now than you were before, or maybe you were convinced in the first place. And what I've just been saying, most recently in the talk, task measurement can have a role in analytic rating scale construction. essentially a bit of repetition. Tasks take a different perspective to tests. That could be extremely valuable and help us to understand really what speaking involves. Using concepts like conceptual formulator and ability for use and the theory of second language speaking guides the sampling that could be done. If you look at it in this way, looking at the third bullet point, there are implications for how long you need to spend testing and how broadly you need to approach testing before you're in an effective position to generalize. Testers are under pressure to do things quickly, minimum amounts of time. I think the sorts of things I'm saying are rather pushing testers to say, you need more time. Okay. Task research can illuminate the approach. Good. And also, I think, looking at task research is a bridge towards communicative language teaching and classroom-based assessment. And that might have a beneficial role in language testing. Right, the last slide. A picture. Well, I gave you a picture earlier. This is the same picture, basically, except it tries to bring together the sorts of things I've been saying during the talk. Again, it's basically Levelt applied to the notion of language testing. And what you can see on the left-hand side is that there will be a task, and the task will generate a performance. And the performance will be rated by people using rating scales. So that, if you like, is the end point. And the rest of it is really trying to organize the context for that testing event and to show that behind the actual test task, there's a great deal going on. And in order to understand the nature of the performance, you've got to have in mind the underlying knowledge sources, ability for use with the various components that I talked about earlier. And then these feed into a task where looking at the task in terms of how it implicates conceptualizer, formulator processes, drawing upon ability for use, which are based upon the knowledge sources, is a much wider framework, but I think a necessary one to understand what's going on in language testing. And so a couple of extras. This year, my model is wearing orange and green. Helen Carpenter made that joke. I love that joke. I don't think my reaction to the joke is shared by many other people, but I think it's funny. And to say again, note how much repackaging is going on. Really, in many ways, what I've been doing is rearranging the sorts of claims that have been made by lots of others. But I hope in a way which is consistent with task research, but also consistent with a psycholinguistic view of what speaking actually is. Finally, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. This was an amazing and insightful talk. Thank you so much. And now, what we'll be doing is asking Peter some questions based on your questions in the chat box. So if you have any more questions, please put them there. Probably that's easier this way than asking people to speak. So I'm going to read out the first question, which appears in the chat box. It came from Nick Moore. Peter, can you see the chat box as well?
No, I can't. I can.
Anyway, I can read them.
It's actually there. I'm looking at you, me, and Anna.
Brilliant. Okay, then I try to be as clear as possible. So okay. Nick Moore is asking, how do we deal with ideas without language prior to the formulator?
No. I mean, we can't. There will be language, of course. And so what we're interested in essentially is the use of language to express ideas. But then which ideas and which language become the issues. And so, give me a moment. If I go back to the 2x2 matrix I had, if you look top left, essentially there, I feel, the idea difficulty is being reduced as much as it can be. And so in this case, also the language is reasonably undemanding. But if you come down to the formulation difficult version, the idea is that the ideas to be expressed are not particularly challenging, but the language is more challenging, either, for example, in a narrative with unavoidable difficult lexis because of the lexis, or when you have more input pressure because a video is running, or where there's greater precision required. So really what I'm trying to do in that whole matrix is to show the possibility that you can manipulate idea difficulty and language difficulty slightly separately. And if it depends then what you're after, presumably, actually, what I should be doing is focusing on the top right. Conceptualizer difficulty, formulator easy. I'm not sure how much you'd want to do this, because in principle, if you could do it, you would be making difficult ideas, but expressed through relatively undemanding language. You might well ask, well, why would you want to do that? Because if you want to do that, why don't you use the person's L1? So, but I wanted to show in principle, you could manipulate the two things slightly separately. And actually, in talking about these things, for the first time, it does occur to me that indeed, why would you want to use the one top right? All the others, I think, would be relevant. Yes, I don't see the point actually of having easy language when what you're trying to do is to assess language. Why make it easy? Yeah. Yeah. Interesting question. Yeah.
Peter, our next question is related. It comes from Shane Gu, who asked, to facilitate Formulator, is it sufficient to just provide ample online planning time for R2 learners?
No, it's a good thing. And really, I think that the systematicity in the research really generated by Rod Ellis has been very useful in demonstrating just how important time pressure, opportunity for online planning is. But hold on, I'm not, just to make it clear. Oh, hello, it's just you. Yeah, excellent. I'm interpreting this question as actually being concerned with tasks in general rather than tasks in relation to testing. Okay, that being the case, the question, I would recast the question as, how can formulator operations be facilitated in a second language task-based context? Well, planning, online planning is one thing. So actually is effective planning. In addition, there is the possibility of repeating tasks. I think the literature on repeating tasks from the last 10 years has been arguably the most interesting development in the entire field, because we've learned that getting people to repeat a task has a very interesting impact upon performance. And what appears to happen is that the first performance primes a much more effective second performance. And if you think about what happens in using Formulator, the conceptualizer delivers a pre-verbal message which has implications for what needs to be retrieved from the formulator. In a first language case, we do this instantly. In a second language case, it's much, much more difficult, but it could be the case that the first performance triggers an attempt to retrieve information in the formulator, which doesn't quite work, but something has happened. Then, in the second performance, you get the benefits of the half-done things from the first performance. So it might well be the case that formulator operations are given a considerable assistance in that second language performance. And in a way, that may have implications for the future, because it's a question of what is involved in learning, what is involved in development. Simply having something in your second language mental lexicon that is there, but you've got to search like hell and take time to get, isn't much use. What you're interested in doing is mobilizing the effectiveness of that knowledge. And it seems to me something like repetition could be an extremely good thing. So could things like modeling. I mentioned very briefly earlier, if you model performance in the Willis co-build course, one of their ways in a main course book, the course book was accompanied by tapes. Oh dear, we are going back in time now. Actual tapes, which contained native speaker model performances of the tasks which were done, which had to be done in the co-build course. And it was therefore open to the teacher to play the tape before the task was done, with the idea that you would be using a model which you could draw upon in the actual task. So no, it's not just online planning. I think that could be a good bit more. Yeah. Right.
Thank you very much, Peter. There were two questions about what online planning is and accuracy, but I think these have been answered later in the talk. So let's skip these because these are early questions. And then we have another interesting question from Shane again, who asked, can all areas of CLAF like complexity, accuracy, lexis, and fluency be raised by providing planning opportunities? In other words, can the trade-off effects be eliminated by properly designing planning conditions?
Yes, I would say so. Okay, let's say as the sort of basic thing, the generalization in the literature is reasonably clear. You get a complexity effect and you get a fluency effect. And if you associate that with effect sizes, they're large, you sometimes get an accuracy effect. And typically, the effect size is not so large. That's your standard result of planning. But I'll give you two conditions where you had general improvement. The first of these was a study I did with Pauline Foster. And in this study, because your standard approach to planning is you give people 10 minutes and they plan individually, alone. But we use some other ways in which you could use that 10 minutes. And in the teacher planning, the teacher animated the planning, organized the planning. And so it was done so that it wasn't simple spoon feeding, but the learners were guided as to what they might plan and how they might approach the planning. In that condition, all areas were raised in performance: complexity, accuracy, and fluency. Hand on heart, I don't think I can say lexis. I don't think we even looked at it. Perhaps another study where all areas were raised was one I alluded to briefly by Jan Wang, where she gave people both pre-task and online opportunities. To spill the beans about this, she wasn't totally convinced about the research designs Rod Ellis had used. I should have said, could you turn the recording off before I said that? And so she wanted to control the online planning condition a little bit more closely. But she also wanted to see, and I'm sorry, and she didn't quite confirm Rod Ellis's results and didn't get quite such a strong accuracy effect from the pure online planning condition. But she did have a combined pre-task planning and online planning condition, and that generated phenomenal increases in performance across the board. So to answer the question, it depends exactly on what you do with planning. And I've just mentioned two ways in which broader performance improvement has been shown. I'm sure there are others, because one of the issues I think has been that, and I'm the most guilty person here, the original studies done on planning were by Rod Ellis in 1987, a long time ago, and Graham Crooks in 1989. And in Graham Crooks, he gave people 10 minutes planning time, and he asked them to take notes during the planning time, although they weren't allowed to use those notes. This was done to stop them looking out the window, I think, basically. Because when you're doing research, you want to do something new, but at the same time, you want to be comparable to what's been done before. The use of 10 minutes and those conditions has had a huge impact on the field. And that's good because it's allowed comparability. But I think perhaps more variety of planning research designs might be a good thing to do to reveal other conditions with different impacts on complexity, accuracy, and fluency at the same time. But I think as a final point, yes, it can happen, which is kind of interesting because my broad response would be to say that there are attentional limitations on performance, but understanding the psycholinguistics of the conditions under which people speak can help you to overcome the limitations, which is what I think happened in those different particular planning contexts. Right.
Thank you very much, Peter. Our next question is a clarification question, probably a quick one, but I think it might be worth asking. What is the difference between pre-task and planning? You sort of touched upon this, but maybe it's good to.
Right. Well, on the one hand, you have pre-task planning, and that typically is what I've just been talking about, 10 minutes and so on, although with variation. But if you think in terms of pedagogy, you can generally obviously think in terms of what happens before, what happens during, and what happens afterwards. Okay. If we're looking at what happens before, the thing that people in our research area have concentrated huge effort to is pre-task planning. But there are many things that could happen pre-task, including planning. So you might have, for example, what I just said about the Willises giving a tape of native speakers doing the same task. You could have some video prompts. You could have consciousness raising activities. Really, yes, I can't avoid saying you could have pre-teaching. Or rather, from a task-based perspective, I would say you could have a consciousness-raising version of free teaching, rather than teaching specific language which needs to be used in the task. So if the broad issue is, what can you do before a task to put people in a better position to do the task? That all comes under the heading pre-task. And one specific bit of it is pre-task planning. Right.
Thank you very much, Peter. The next question is a very relevant one in today's world, unfortunately, or fortunately, this time. When do we expect time pressure in speaking more, online or face-to-face classroom? What would be your prediction? I assume it's more of a question about prediction.
Can you say that again? What?
When do we expect time pressure, more time pressure in speaking, in an online or a face-to-face context?
What does online mean?
What we're doing now, I assume, like, you know, being in a face-to-face versus more of a digital. That's my interpretation, like in a Zoom call or online versus face-to-face communication.
Oh, I see. Well, I would certainly say the time pressure is greater in an online context, because I'm working on the assumption that with an online context, you are more likely to be responsible to keep time being filled by talking. And you might be sensitive to some degree of time pressure if you have to get a task done. In face-to-face communication, you've got the possibility that you've got your interlocutor who will say things. And while your interlocutor is saying things, you obviously will be listening to your interlocutor, as we are listening to one another now, aren't we, Andrea? Yes. And you can plan. You can use your interlocutor's turn partly to pay attention to what they're saying, but partly as well to be planning what you're going to say next. So in some ways, there's a built-in lack of time pressure in face-to-face communication. But of course, face-to-face communications differ considerably, and some indeed are more pressured than others. I mean, I imagine anyone in a face-to-face communication with Piers Morgan would think there's a great deal of pressure involved, but let's say normal face-to-face communication, I think there should be less pressure, the more natural it is. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Now we have an elaborate question. Right. I do my best to convey it, or maybe you have access to the chat box now, but I read it.
No, well, I'm sorry to be so hopeless about this, but
don't worry, I'm going to just listen.
Okay.
So the question comes from Michael Sadagi. And first, a bit of a description of the problem. The whole process of speech production requires a certain level of cognitive resources, especially at the elementary stage of language proficiency. Several studies examined the effect of modality, but it was limited to the mode of performance, speaking or writing. What interests me the most is the fact that input modality or multimodality also takes cognitive resources, as shown by the recent studies that have focused on the role of multimodality in language comprehension and acquisition. But in pedagogy and research, these tasks are used as prompts for language production. In other words, I'm thinking whether it was legitimate to examine how multimodal input affects language production as measured by CAF. My main concerns are the mediating roles of limited cognitive resources. Interesting question.
Am I expected to give an answer?
You can speculate, I assume.
I think it's an excellent point that's been made. No, I'm serious. I think it's an excellent point that's been made. Because indeed, I mean, coming back actually to the previous thing with face-to-face communication, indeed, you've got to process what your interlocutor is saying, and that takes resources. Yeah. If, though, we're dealing with multimodal input, which is a little bit different, obviously, because this input is meant to be helpful as far as pedagogy is concerned. So I think the first thing is that those structuring the multimodal input do have to think very carefully about the burden that follows from the nature of the input. To go back a little further again, I was talking about with the task, the pre-task, the task and the post-task. This is actually broadening what might be done at the pre-task stage, because I don't think, particularly at lower levels of proficiency, that you can simply assume that the input will be processed. So somehow it may need to be prepared for. The multimodal input would need to have pre-work done to make it accessible. And the nature of that input needs to be explored very considerably. There are going to be skills in designing it. There may even be a need to pilot it to make sure that it has worked effectively in the way it was designed to work. So yes, I mean, I can see it. It is actually a question which bears upon the conceptualizer-formulator relationship in its way, and how something can get in the way of an effective operation of normal speaking. Yeah. So I don't think that was a very good answer, but the best I can do, on the spot.
I thought it was a good answer and a good question as well.
Yes.
And now we're moving on to Stefano Banno's question, who says, a poser is a poser, a repairer is a repairer. In order to distinguish disfluencies due to L1 transfer and actual disfluencies, would it make sense to focus on the parts of speech or syntactic elements these disfluencies refer to?
Yes. And that's a wide open research area. There we are, straight away. No, but to go back to the beginning, the people who have looked at this that I'm aware of, and I think this is a sub-literature which is growing, but two studies which impressed me enormously are the one done by Tracy Derwing in Canada, and I think from memory, she looked at an L1 Mandarin group, I think, and an L1 Slavic languages group. And she monitored their fluency in their L1s, and she monitored their fluency over an extended period, I think possibly up to about a year. And I think she was able to show over that length of time clear connections between L1 and L2 pausing. But I don't think she was looking at things in as great detail as to look at different parts of speech. And I think the effect also reduced for the Slav language group as time went on. Nivea de Jong has reported similar sorts of research. Now then, this is going to irritate people again who didn't see the Saturday conference, but the person passing on this question to me reported on a study looking at the difference between pauses in the middle of a clause and pauses at the end of a clause, at the end of a sentence. Questions on this should be directed to Andrea Revesz. And it seems to me, if we are looking at this issue of part of speech, it's connected. It's going to be connected with exactly that distinction between pauses within and pauses between. Because if you're looking at because the claims are that pauses between may have more of a conceptualizer linkage and pauses within more of a formulator linkage, especially where they're concerned with low frequency lexical items, which is the final way of getting to the question which was asked. So yes, I think there's a lot of scope for this. And because in a sense, I feel the studies by Derwing and de Jong have opened up a possibility which wasn't there before. And typically when this happens, what you can do next is look at it in more detail, because one question opens up many, many more questions. And I think Stefano's question is effectively doing exactly that. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. I think we have time maybe for one last question. Fangli was asking about some sources, but I think the slides and references will be available. So, so you'll get the answer to your question from those. But there is one last question from Shane again, who says the following. From cognitive psychology, some researchers argue that most successful planners will seize the opportunity to switch between top-down planning and bottom-up planning. My question is it possible that planning strategies used in pre-task planning will be reused during online planning when new information are provided within task? And very thankful for answering all the questions Shane poses.
He mentioned there, you mentioned there right at the end, new information. Just a small thing I'll mention here. Another study I did with Pauline Foster. The study in question was, the task rather was to give people crimes, and in pairs they had to discuss what punishment would be appropriate for these different crimes. And in this study, we wondered how long the effects of planning would last. So we gave them planning, but we had two groups. And after 5 minutes, we gave one group new surprise information, which changed the way you would interpret the what had happened, what was being described in the crimes. Additional information which suggested that somebody had done the same sort of thing several times before, for example. It didn't have any impact whatsoever. Luckily, you know, in terms of wanting to publish something, we had designed some other things into that study, so we were able to publish it. But the hope that giving people conflicting, different information would produce an effect, useless, didn't work at all. I don't know how typical that is. The fact that we didn't find it doesn't mean that it wouldn't be found. But I do like what Shane was talking about in terms of top down and bottom up. And I think in some ways, what he's saying there connects very much with the 2014 publication in the bibliography with Francine Pang, because what we found from qualitative research was people were very rich in what they said about the things they did during planning. And although we didn't use the terms top down and bottom up, in some ways we could have. So yes, I mean, to look at planning more generally, because it's come up in several questions, it seems to me as researchers, we've looked at planning, but there's colossal scope to take a more pedagogic perspective towards planning. We've somewhat slavishly, as I said earlier, followed Graham Crook's. Really perhaps greater variety in what people do during that planning period and opening it up much more than we have. We have black boxed it a lot. Could be very interesting to see that not all planning is created equal. And that when you look at planning in this way, it might be of much, it should already be of interest in pedagogy, but it could be of even greater interest in pedagogy if we opened it up a little bit more than we have. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think this is all we had time for today. And it's not just my thanks. If you saw the chat boxes, there are a lot of very grateful comments there. Thanking you for a wonderful presentation and for taking the time to answer all these questions. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending. It was lovely to see so many people, so many of you, or hear, or to feel your presence in this talk.
Oh, look, Roger Gilbert just came up, yes. Okay, thank you very much indeed then.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to start.